Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere is one of those games that has always stuck with me and left me wanting more. It's a unique entry in the game series as the third game explores the world of Ace Combat set several decades into the future, taking place in 2040. By this time, the major military powers are no longer countries or territories, but two huge corporations vying for power and dominance, General Resource and Newcom. In between the two powers is the peacekeeping group UPO, standing for Universal Peace Enforcement Organization. They're essentially the United Nations of the future, trying to keep a buffer between the corporations and preventing an all-out war. It was Ace Combat 3's unique vision of the future that always drew me back to it, and I always hoped that a sequel down the line would revisit this timeline. As that hasn't really been the case, I thought I'd give this game another playthrough but with a bit of a twist. The gameplay for Ace Combat 3 is pretty straightforward. Review the mission you're about to undertake, select your plane and off you go. Some planes will be more suited to ground attack missions and others will give you a better chance if you're dogfighting up in the clouds. Depending on the aircraft you choose, you may be able to select different primary and secondary weapons, a first in the Ace Combat series, and it's fun trying out different planes and loadouts. As you progress through the missions, you'll gain access to more advanced aircraft with better handling characteristics and generally more ammo. I will say, however, you can generally get through the game pretty well choosing the fighter aircraft most of the time. Missions consist of taking out the primary targets which will appear as red on your radar, destroy all targets to complete the mission or to advance to the next phase. Optional targets will appear as white radar blips and aren't necessary for completing the mission, but will affect your overall mission rating. If you want to achieve an A rank, then you'll need to take out a variety of targets as fast as possible. Difficulty ramps up gradually, and you'll notice enemy planes start to get more aggressive in the later missions. You'll be faced with a few tough encounters when you're pitted against story characters, though it's mostly just a case of trying to get a successful lock-on as they evade you. I played through the game several times on normal difficulty and didn't feel that I was struggling at any point. In saying that, I've been playing the Ace Combat games for years, so I'm more than familiar with surviving a few dogfights. Mission variety is also very good. You'll be doing your typical dogfighting and bombing runs, but some missions will have you up in the stratosphere in specialised aircraft. There's even a mission set in space with entirely different physics. So what's different about the version I'm reviewing here? Well, if you're not aware, Ace Combat 3 actually had two pretty distinct releases. If you're like me, then originally you would have played the international release of this game, that being the European and North American versions, released in early 2000. I enjoyed the game a great deal back in the day, and it was a title I always looked forward to replaying. Where things get interesting is when we look at the original Japanese release from mid-1999, and this is a version we'll be looking at in particular. You could argue that this is an entirely different game nearly. Not only does it have a much deeper and differing storyline, but contains more missions, more varied gameplay elements, and access to some additional plane variations. There's so much extra content here that the Japanese release is spread out over 2 game discs. What's likely taking up that space is the vast amount of animated cutscenes this version has. For every mission there's a wealth of story being told through various cutscenes and character interactions, to the point I think even Metal Gear Solid could be given a run for its money. Not only that, but there's a lot of dialogue and chatter happening during the gameplay too, as well as plenty more in-game cutscenes and moments during your missions. Most importantly of all perhaps is the decision system, where the player will be required to make a choice during a mission which will impact the rest of the game. This is all well and good, but unfortunately if you're like me and you're not fluent in Japanese, then all of this storyline will be pretty much impossible to understand and you'll be missing out. That's where Project Nemo comes in. Created by Team Nemo, Project Nemo is an English translation patch for the game created by a team of dedicated Ace Combat fans. This patch provides English subtitles for near enough all the game's content and allows players to explore the full world of Ace Combat 3. I can't stress enough how enjoyable it was to play through this version of the game and have a clear understanding of what's happening. It's Ace Combat 3 in this form that I want to talk about, because it's an experience I think many fans of the series have potentially missed out on. I think this will become more of an all-around recommendation rather than a review, based on how much I enjoyed playing through this. So let's talk about some of the improvements the Japanese version has over the international release. Straight away, there's a story. This version of the game explores the world of Ace Combat 3 in much more detail. You'll be getting familiar with a cast of detailed animated characters, all whom have their own affiliations and intentions. Characters will keep in touch with the player and comment on your actions. It's possible to befriend enemies and turn against your old allies, to the point you'll even be facing them in combat. There's a possible 5 endings depending on decisions the player makes, and this can affect who lives and dies. You'll be able to see the story unfold through the perspective of each warring faction and character, learning their motivation and why they've chosen the path they're on. I don't want to spoil too much of the game's plot, as I'd like people to enjoy this game as I did. There are several decisions the player can make in-game, and they have a substantial impact on the path you'll take going forwards. You initially start out as a UPO pilot, but your choices can actually change which side of the war you're on, and you can become a pilot for General Resource or Newcom should you choose to. Join another faction and you'll be greeted to their side. Your interface will reboot to their version too. The most interesting aspect of this is you'll now be exclusively flying that side's planes, and you can find yourself on the opposite side of a mission. A good example here is if you join General Resource, you'll be tasked with destroying a Newcom airbase, and you'll be flying General Resource planes in their liveries. This also makes several neutral characters now your wingmen, who will chat to you during the mission. Stick with UPO and instead you'll be defending that airbase on behalf of Newcom, fending off the General Resource attackers. There's several examples of missions where you'll get to see the events unfold from different angles, whilst using different technology to fight your battles. As mentioned before, your wingmen will change depending on who you're fighting for or against, but in nearly all missions you'll have fellow wingmen flying alongside you. Missions where you'd be solo in the international release will instead have allies and enemies chatting away and putting in work to either help or hinder you. You're not able to command your wingmen or alter their aircraft, but they will usually take a few targets down for you, or at least distract a few enemy planes. There are 52 missions in the Japanese release, opposed to the International's 36. Whilst it's always nice to get more content, it's important to note that even missions you've already played may have additional objectives, or play differently thanks to additional story elements. Even when I was going through familiar missions, they felt fresh and interesting, as you're generally learning something about the game world. Whilst there isn't a huge difference in the planes you have access to, you'll find yourself using a different roster of aircraft depending on who you align with during the story. This means you might be using different planes in different liveries from what you'd be using in the international release. So if you're a fan of the Ace Combat series, then all I can say is this version of Ace Combat 3 is absolutely worth a play. This game really laid down the foundation for the series going forwards, with its heavy emphasis on story and characters. It's the only game in the series to have multiple endings based on choices you make in game, and the only Ace Combat that lets you actually join to another faction's side and experience missions from different perspectives. The visual design of this game still stands up to this day, with its unique, futuristic yet grounded in reality design. Some of the planes just look incredible, and you can tell the team behind this were really putting everything they had into this game. This was an era when Namco were pumping out amazing games like Ridge Racer Type 4 and Tekken 3. They knew how to make good looking games on the PlayStation. I'm running this on an emulator which really lets me turn up the visuals, and you soon forget this was a game intended to be running on hardware that came out in 1994. It still runs and plays exceptionally well for an old 3D game of this era. The music and sound effects of this game are also top notch, with some fantastic music that borders on surreal ambience yet has a good rhythm to it. It's a sound style really unique to this game and suits the theme perfectly. I'll leave you to soak up some of Ace Combat 3's atmosphere, and I really do hope you give this version of the game a chance. I'll leave a link in the description to the Project Nemo website. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.